Wonderful. Thank you. I want to start today by thanking Diane and the Lev Ha'ir Heart of the City Education Committee, because these are the people who choose our topic and shape these sessions, and then everyone gets to stream into them. But I also especially today want to thank Wendy Jordan, who is here, because this topic was actually proposed by Wendy Jordan, who wrote up a beautiful petition on could we do something on the matriarchs that became this class. Wonderful topic, because in some way, every single one of us here, male or female, is a spiritual and or physical descendant of those Jewish matriarchs, the founding women in our Jewish generations. We are the inheritors of their stories. So there's really kind of a direct line, a direct stream coming through the generations into us. We are going to start with our Torah prayer together, same as candle lighting blessing, but it ends la'asok b'divrei Torah. Are we ready? Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you for the inspiration to immerse ourselves in learning. And I will save a moment of visual access, hoping that Joanne joins us so that she can be part of that. So we're starting with Sarah today. I gave you some biblical references to Sarah. I don't know who here had a chance to look up the little snippets that we have about her that are in the actual Torah. Some people did. Okay, great. Another place we encounter Sarah very regularly in our liturgy is in the Amidah prayer, which had said traditionally 3 times a day, although that's very recent. The mothers did not used to be included in that prayer where we're talking about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob until recent times. I'm going to say something else about that. Another place we now encounter Sarah is in our Meshaberach prayer, where we call on those ancestors. You hear me doing that healing prayer a lot. And we always call on the merit of these ancestors. And we're going to be talking about some of the problems of how we encounter Sarah. Did anybody notice anything in what you read in the Torah? So what you actually have from the most ancient sources about our matriarch Sarah. Any impressions or thoughts at this point about from people who read those biblical quotes? And many of you have heard those Torah stories over the years about Sarah as well. Anybody have any first impressions about what you read in the text about the life of Sarah? Beverly, why don't you unmute, because I think you're talking. All right, Beverly.
Okay, you hear me? Okay. Yep. No, I don't like what Sarah did. I didn't think she was a very nice person. She threw her guy out, and that bothered me a great deal.
Ah, so you ended up with sort of a negative impression of this
founder. Very much so.
Very interesting. Ed.
Well, it's interesting to reread this, and you know, it's not directly, it's not on Sarah, it's not Sarah's fault, but it's interesting that twice in those early years, Abraham acquires his wealth by disguising the fact that Sarah's his wife, which you know, submits her to subordination to the king of Egypt, and then another king, and each time that she undergoes that disguise, his wealth increases, his servants, and he's acquired Hagar through that same pantomime with in Egypt.
So Ed raises a really interesting question. Why are there stories in the Torah about how Abraham introduces his wife Sarah as his sister to foreign dignitaries? Why would he lie and say she's my sister when she was his wife? And that actually helped him financially build his wealth. So there's a big kind of conundrum there that has puzzled people for years. We're actually going to address that. Anybody else in your encounter with the texts about Sarah from the Torah? Any first impressions? Fran?
Well, I thought it was interesting that when the three wise men come, or the strangers, or yeah, I think they're the strangers, come in, he runs out to greet them. So he's like Mr. External, and she is sort of stayed behind and internal. So it's like the traditional role of him greeting, her staying behind, being sort of internal, and having this conversation, sort of overhearing the conversation, I think is the way it's said, that she overhears them saying that she's going to have a child, and she sort of laughs. And then there's something where she's chided, or he's chided her, that you laughed, and she says, oh no, I didn't laugh, or something there. So there's this sort of dynamic back and forth of him being the external sort of political gatherer, and she being sort of the internal, okay, I'm going to keep things going at home type of thing.
Very interesting, the kind of public and private roles that they each take in the stories. Stacy, and then Karen Zeitz.
Thank you. I try and put it in historical perspective that I think it was really dangerous for women back then, you know? And I think that when strange men came to town, that was one of their primary aims, was taking the women, you know? So I like to look at it as honorable, actually, that he decided to call her his sister, because that gives a little bit more, makes the men maybe think a little bit differently about how aggressive they're going to be. Like, it seems
Very
like
interesting.
wives were like, you know, wives you could take because they'd already been taken, but sisters were, you know, family, really family. So that's sort of
Very
my
interesting.
impression. Yeah.
Thank you for that. All right, Karen Zeitz.
Yeah, you know, whatever we may think of Sarah, what I think is really illuminating is that God defends her to Abraham when she says, you know, I want this woman out, and Abraham hesitates, you know, for obvious reasons. He has a son with her and doesn't want her to go. God says, no, listen to your wife. Like, I have too much invested in this marriage for you to wreck it now, because I want to start a whole nation from you all, and just do what she says. So, you know, something there that God defends this woman.
Beautiful. So everybody hold on to all these observations, because we're going to be weaving them into a story today. I want to just share one thing I notice when I read the biblical text is about Sarah, is how much the story is actually not being told about her. It's Abraham's history. And we're kind of trying to guess what was going on with Sarah. Like, people in this Zoom room have had various really interesting speculations, but a lot isn't known because the story's told. Basically, you know, history is written by the victors, they say, but, you know, who got to write the public story of these things was not Sarah's descendants directly. So we're still kind of guessing, but there's been lots of great discussion. I'm going to just stop for a moment to do some visual access here and then carry on. We have, I think, maybe 26 people in this Zoom room. We have people coming in from Paraguay and New York and California, as well as all over the Philadelphia area. And I am sitting in front of my world map, as I do in my home Zoom station, wearing my embroidered kippah because we are studying together. It's a holy act. And we have Louisa Elfman helping us as our Zoom tech person today because Bobby is away. So thank you again, Louisa. Okay. let's start, while we hold on to all those strands that people lifted up of initial observations there. The people we're supposed to admire in different religious traditions are constructed very differently. Let's think, for instance, think about like the Greek and Roman gods, who are kind of like the models for people in that religion, ancient religion, the Greek and Roman gods. If you think about them, you know, they were kind of human. They had jealousy, they had intrigue, but they also had kind of divine superpowers. They were kind of half human, half something else, right? How many people here have ever delved into Greek gods? Yeah, so you're supposed to be kind of in awe of them, but not exactly emulate them, right? Because they're just not fully human. Okay, think about Catholic saints. Now, some of you actually have been in Catholic school, I believe, in this Zoom room. What would you say about Catholic saints? What are we supposed to get from studying the lives of Catholic saints, which is a very big part of Catholic education, or even if you've witnessed it with people close to you? What are you supposed to take from studying Catholic saints? Teresa?
That they were perfect,
Yeah.
and that that's what you're supposed to be like a saint, and if you're not, dun, 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 dun. Anyway, yeah.
Right. It's supposed to be like a model for a perfect person. Teresa, oh no, wait, Debbie, did you want to say something about that?
Well, the thing I know most about Catholic saints is that most of them died horrifically to stand up for their faith. I
Okay.
don't know, more modern saints, but you know,
Okay.
they were grilled on an open flame, or you know, on and on, horrible things.
And then
But-
I would say with the Hindu gods, each one kind of represents, you know, a piece of reality, like the destructive force or the creative force or something like that. There's many different aspects of what a human life would be like, but each one is kind of carved out. In Judaism, the lens that we're going to use for today and for this series in looking at the matriarchs is, I think, a much more, it's a deeply rooted Jewish lens, which is humanity, the lens of humanity. These matriarchs, they're not perfect people. They're not semi-gods with special powers. They're very human. And so what are we supposed to learn? So we're going to be really exploring, like, what is it we're supposed to take away from having these matriarchs that we refer to repeatedly in our prayer and in our Torah cycle? What are we supposed to learn from it? We're certainly not supposed to learn that they always did the right things. Every single one of the matriarchs was kind of a very complicated person who made mistakes and did some questionable things. I don't think what we're supposed to learn is that this is who we're supposed to emulate in that sense. I think it's something about, you know, these people were human beings who faced what it means to be human, which is hard. They had difficult choices to make. They had complicated situations to resolve. And basically, they did the best they could. And this is a record of the journey of what they could do in the moment. I really hope, in a way, we come out of this series with more empathy for each of them, even when they made a decision that we don't agree with today, or that we could criticize, because who has lived a perfect life? I mean, right? We all get way in over our heads, face the absolute unimaginable, because that's what happens in a human life. You face more than you ever imagined you could face at certain moments, and you do the best you can. And that's what these matriarchs did. Now, also, in our tradition gives a word to each of our founding fathers and mothers that we're supposed to remember them by. So Abraham, for instance, gets remembered by the word loving kindness, chesed. that's because of his hospitality to the visiting messengers, angels. If you really think about it, Sarah was equally there greeting those messengers, and she was the one who was like cooking them food and taking it out to them. But the word that is given to Sarah is that she was righteous. Now, what exactly righteous means is sort of left up to our imaginations, but that's the word that's given by our tradition about Sarah. And I think, we'll talk more about this, but when we look at these matriarchs through a very human lens, we're asking, what can we learn about their journeys that helps us be the best humans we can be today when we also face impossible situations or demanding or confusing or scary or, and that's very different than what we get from Greek gods or Catholic saints or Hindu goddesses. What we're getting here is like, what does it mean to be a human being on a journey and do the best you can? Does anybody want to comment on that kind of lens that we'll be using there? Ed?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I was thinking, Julie, as we compare the patriarchs and the matriarchs, as you were talking about the imperfections of the matriarchs, I nod that the patriarchs were just as human and absolutely just as imperfect.
Right.
And yet in tradition, we ask God to treat us kindly on the merit of our patriarchs, v'zocher chaste ovos. And then I'm just confused. You're giving us fresh information for me that's provocative, because the merit of our ancestors literally is chesed. And you describe chesed as literally hospitality. So, that's kind of limited virtue. I just, I like to hope that if in Reconstructionism we cite the names of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, I hope we can think equally of, not only their imperfections, but their merits. And I have a grievance with our choice in Reconstructionism of naming the matriarchs. We omit the names of the handmaidens.
Bilhah and Zilpah.
Yeah.
Bilhah and
And
Zilpah.
and that level of privilege and selection kind of bothers me. So that's it. I don't want to sway too far from where we are.
No, Ed, that's great. And you're actually kind of, what's it called? Whatever, or exactly where I'm going with this. So give us a minute. Louisa, you have your hand up there.
Yes, what I was going to say.
I think you're echoing because I think you've got two devices. One of them has to be muted.
Yes, just give me a minute. Sorry about that. Okay. I thought I had one muted. Okay.
Actually, I think it has to be turned off, not merely muted.
I think it may be working now. Or you could put what you want to say in the chat box and I can read it out. We can't hear you, Louisa. I don't know if you're trying to talk to us, but okay, well, if she writes something in the chat box, I will share it with everybody. Yes, so picking up from Ed's, first of all, Ed, it was just Abraham who got the word chesed, that we're supposed to remember loving kindness from Abraham, but all of the ancestors we're praying. Oh, thanks. Okay. We're praying exactly as Ed said, because of their merit, we are hoping for blessings today, because of the merit of our ancestors. Zechut, that's the merit. So we're going to be asking ourselves, well, what was their merit? Like, what exactly did they do that's supposed to give us a channel to God's blessing? Like, what was it about them? It definitely wasn't, in Sarah's case, every decision she made, or, I don't think it was in any of their cases. So what was their humanity that they brought to meeting their moment? Because I think that's the merit that we're drawing down on here. And they met their moments as best they could, and they were human. It's sort of another way of saying, look, you guys are living a human life. It's complicated. No one has a perfect track record. Get out there, do the best you can like they did in their moments. And we draw down the merit that they lived to the best of their ability in their moment. And that's huge. It's a huge bolstering of our ability to meet our moment. So we're going to divide. Okay, I will read what Louise is writing here. I was thinking that both religions and the history of the Old and New Testament ask us to look at the people as humans and to learn from their journeys, especially when we are having a hard journey ourselves. I think that's so right, Louisa. It's not about an outcome of a particular thing that the ancestor decided. It's more about they wrestled with what it means to be human in their moment, just like we have to do. And every single one of us has faced the joys, the sorrows, the challenges of being a human being, not being a god or a saint, in other words, right? It's much more messy and complicated and kind of honest, I would say, in Jewish tradition, to get to look at role models who also wrestled and struggled and faced really complicated, difficult situations, just like each of us does. Stacy's asking in the chat box, would you say these ancestors were survivalists? That is an interesting question, because certainly a goal of each generation was to carry on the family tree. And especially for the women took a lot of agency and power in making sure there would be a next generation that they felt excited about in the Jewish family tree. So I do think there was an eye towards what, who, in a certain way, you would say, we would ask the question like this, okay, I'm going to be an ancestor. Me. And each of you, in some way, spiritually or biologically, we are going to be the ancestors. So what do we want that family tree that we are mentoring to look like? And they took a lot of agency in figuring out who would be the next generation in terms of who their kids would marry and who got pregnant by who and those kind of things. Right? Anybody want to comment on any of that up to this point? I don't think I see any hands there. Okay. Really good. So we're going to divide Sarah's life into 3 different eras. In the first era of her life, she is a young woman growing up in Mesopotamia in the same culture that her partner-to-be, Avram, is growing up in. And she is named, anybody know what her original name is? The Torah tells us. She doesn't start out being Sarah. She starts out being, Fran?
Sarai.
Right. Her first name is Sarai, and Abraham's first name is Avram. And they're basically being raised in a polytheistic culture in ancient Mesopotamia, where, there's the god of the sun and the god of the corn and the god of the river. And we know some parts of the story because we know that Abraham hears Lech Lecha, get yourself going, on a journey of self-discovery to a land you do not know. We know the beautiful song, which is actually in the feminine, written about Sarah. Lechi la, to a land that I will show you. Lech lecha, to a place you do not know. Now, eventually on that journey, where they will end up is in the land of promise, the land of Israel. But they have a long, winding journey before they get there. And there is a feminist take it's on Sarah's early life that is really interesting. And it helps put together some of these other sort of hard to understand puzzle pieces that people lifted up, like why did Abraham lie about she was his sister and not his wife and things like that. And this feminist version of Sarah's life was written up and introduced to the world by a brilliant Torah scholar with PhD in ancient Near Eastern studies named Dr. Savina Tuval in a book called Sarah the Priestess. And it's somewhat academic. I don't necessarily recommend the book, but I'm going to summarize her analysis here about Sarah's early life. Savina Tuval believes that Sarah may have been a priestess in the Mesopotamian religion. That she was being raised up to be a priestess. Priestesses had a lot of authority. They were kind of basically they led the rituals, and they were in an embodied way responsible for the seasonal cycle continuing in that religion. There'd be fertility rites in the spring and sort of death rites in the fall as winter was about to come. And it was, an ancient kind of earth-based, women-led polytheistic religion. And there's a bunch of evidence that Sarah was actually a priestess in this tradition. And there's little clues in the Torah, like she had a lot of authority. For instance, I think it was Karen who said, lifted up the quote before, whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says. That there's that endorsement from God. That's kind of amazing. Your average nobody doesn't get the statement from God, do what this person says. She was one reason she could be considered so righteous was that she was kind of a prophetess in that stage of her life. And the big context was one of a huge transition into patriarchal religion at that time. The whole world was moving away from earth-based, feminine-led spirituality, which had been there for thousands of years, into a different kind of system, which we would call patriarchy. And many scholars have talked about that transition. I just recently finished a very big fat book about that transition from kind of Neolithic Bronze Age time that was very agriculturally earth-based into a situation of more like domination by kings and stratification and land-based economies rather than hunter and gatherer and whatever. So anyway, so this whole transition was happening actually over a few thousand years, but that Sarah was a piece of this where there was a struggle between matriarchal and eventually patriarchal religion, because there was that huge shift all over that part of the world. If you go to museums, even the University of Pennsylvania documents it in, the little fertility statues, the hearth goddesses, the priestesses, the cycle of the year being led by the women who made sure that fertility of nature returned and fertility of human beings returned, and that it was mourned when it left as the seasons changed. So the theory is that Sarai was actually, in that kind of period of struggle, wrestling, and that was one reason that Abraham introduces her as his sister, because in the women-based fertility rituals, genealogy was done differently than in the patriarchal, where, it's more the way we do it now, where how we're counted as siblings or not siblings, because in their family tree, Sarah and Abraham shared a father. They didn't share a mother, but they shared a father. And so in the women's way of counting genealogy, they would be counted as siblings. In that way of doing things, they would be counted as siblings. And Savina Tubal discusses this at length. In the more patriarchal way, they would not be counted as siblings. You would only be a sibling if you were in the womb of the same person. You were womb siblings, and they didn't share a mother. So that it's possible, says Savina Tubal, that Abraham was actually following Sarah's system for naming the relationships there in her religion when he introduced her that way. You know, it's interesting to think about that. It's really interesting. Karen.
Yeah, I just had a question. According to this book, I thought the priestesses did not marry. I thought they were
Right, so right.
like
So,
virgins, the priestesses back then.
right. So this is a whole struggle and shift. It's a new way of doing something. And then when she's so infertile, which meant she never tried to do anything like that. She was an old age and didn't have a baby because she was in a priestess lineage where that's not what you do. Exactly like you're saying, Karen. But then she gets a new name. Very early in her story, God gives her the name Sarah with the H.
But I mean, if her life path was this priestess, right? A single unmarried life. I mean,
right, and she
it's just a
huge
diversion, a huge shift for her.
Right.
To go off with this guy and leave the whole place. I mean, he must have really been something.
So yeah, think about that. Think about if she was training in a feminist priestly lineage, and there's this huge disruption, and it's almost like just a huge life upheaval, and she's really doing a different life path. She gets a different name at that juncture. She aligns with Abraham. Now, thinking of her as a human being, has anybody here, you don't have to tell the story, but can anybody really relate to having a kind of upheaval that takes you on a different path than what you had planned in your own life? Can anybody relate to that? Where there's maybe an internal struggle about who are you going to be and who are you going to align with? Who are your people? I see some people. And I wonder if people kind of explore even your own life path. There may be times when it wasn't just linear, like you didn't just start out and you knew exactly how it was going to go, like where you had to make like inconsistent choices to either get out of a situation that wasn't working for you or to invent something new that could work for you. Most lives are not just linear where we just bop along and it's all perfect and you take the next step and you end up somewhere. Most lives have some places where there's an internal wrestle, struggle, you meeting the moment. And we don't know what that looked like for Sarah, but we can imagine that initial era of her life may have looked like she was raised in the Mesopotamian world and her life ended up on a very different path. Any thoughts about that? I see Enid.
No, I don't have a thought about that, but I'm a little confused. Go back to your comment that Sarah and Sarai and Abram could have come from with the same father. Would you? You just let that dangling, and
Yeah, in their family tree, it's actually biblical. And let's see if I can find anything to quote you here. But okay, so it was Terach who was the ancestor there. And Terach, as happened in those days, had one wife and then a different wife. And Abraham came from mother one. Sarah came from mother two, but they actually had the same father, Terach. And that's recounted in the Bible's genealogy. I have a family tree here, but I don't know if people can see it. So, but it's basically Terach's the dad. He had 2 different wives, as was done back then. Abraham came from one, Sarah came from the other. So they had a shared father, but not a shared mother.
Well, then if that were true, well, again, we're dealing in different times. Even if they were half siblings or whatever, I mean, as we look at today, they wouldn't have married each other.
Well, back then they had different marriage rules. People did marry close kin. It
Right.
happened all the time in the Bible, actually. But so the idea is that in Sarah's sort of priestly religion, having the same father made you sisters. So that when Abraham deferred to her way of doing and introduced her as a sister on the travels, he was
Right.
just deferring to her way of doing the lineage. Whereas in the evolving system that's closer to what we do now, you had to have the same father and mother, or you wouldn't have been. So anyway, they were sisters and not sisters, and he certainly wasn't claiming her as a wife, because it would have been dangerous, probably, in the same way that I think Stacy said.
Okay.
There was some self-interest for him in choosing her way of doing it in that way. I see in the chat box, Luis is writing, many times we do not realize the choices, job, family, etc., that we make are an internal struggle because they are not moving to a new place or location. So true. But I think about, like, I look at my kids who are young adults, there's an overwhelming amount of choice in building your life path. It's like, what city, what partner, what career. It's just a lot. And all of us encounter those things at various different stages, I think. Joanne, you can unmute.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you asked, has anyone, had the experience of you think you're doing X and then your life sort of turns into Y. And that's encapsulated in the Yiddish slogan about man plans and God laughs.
Yeah. Thank you. That's true. Paul.
Well, this is going to be a little bit of a leap, but when you talked about Sarah and, having a different name and really having a different perspective, I came to me Gloria Steinem. And the reason is that she was almost like a high priestess of feminism. She really, really was, people really respected her choices and how she was. And then when she was way into her 60s, she married. She had never married before, and she married this guy, and she fell in love, and she basically nursed him to death. They only were together 3 years, but she even said, I'm just Googling her, but she said, she would not have seen marriage as anything appropriate until it could be a marriage of equals. So I think even she changed from her life path that everybody knew. Gloria Steinem, it wasn't about marriage. It was about, equality and feminism and all these powerful things. But this woman, when you mentioned it, I see how she shifted into a role that I still remember it. And his son was Christian Bale, the actor, and he died 3 years later. But she said, well, I think even here that, she said now it is possible to make an equal marriage. So I think that she was one of those people that I could think of that totally did not plan her life to be that. She was probably content and solid in what she was, but that's just what I wanted to add because that popped in my head when you mentioned it.
Thank you, Paul.
She was kind of a high priest.
And we can only imagine for Sarah, was it that she fell in love with Abraham? Was it a spiritual calling that monotheism made more sense to her than polytheism? So she aligned with this? Was it a family arrangement that somehow she was given over? We don't know. We can only imagine, but some big shift in her course of life seems to have taken place, and a new name recognized that. So when we think about the merit of Sarah, to me, what that means is in her moment, in her situation, she did the best she could. I mean, she had what agency she could have. She made, she carried on the journey. So we're going to move to another era of Sarah's life. And this is the era when, yes, she has her miraculous pregnancy. Well, actually a little bit before that. We're gonna move to a little bit before that. She's married to Abraham, but she isn't getting pregnant. She's really dealing with life not looking like what she had hoped it would look like. Has anybody ever had a situation where what you hoped for and expected isn't what looks like is happening? I mean, I think these are really human things. So I think probably all of us have had that kind of experience. And she had to make a decision because she had joined this project that was becoming Judaism. She had committed, aligned, partnered with Abraham, taken her new name. But if there wasn't a child in the next generation, this big project was not going to continue. But she had some kind of a passionate dream, maybe, we don't really know. But somehow she had gone on that journey to find the land she did not know. And for that journey to continue, there had to be a next generation. So, Stacy, you had your hand up there?
Well, I was gonna, I mean, I'm so happy to hear you even just verbalize that, yes, all of us humans have these huge events in our life that change our path. And I feel kind of weird being the only one to like speak up here, but it just reminded me of, I also like never intended to get married, never intended to have kids. I was going to be, congressperson or some advocacy person, I just never thought that marriage was for me. But when my mom died when I was 25, I just kind of felt lost, and I happened to meet a man that I thought, well, maybe I could marry. But I had planned with a girlfriend, we were going to like get a house in New Hampshire and have a farm and 1 million children, adopt children, and just, if we needed to be serviced, we'd fly into New York, whatever, it was like, whatever. We were like, it wasn't going to happen. We just didn't want that. And then all of a sudden, I guess I fell in love and got married, and my whole life changed. But I still look back often about the trajectory of my life and what would have happened if my mom had not passed. I mean, that, I don't know now when I'm thinking about that was like the defining moment that made me change. But emotionally, I just maybe couldn't go on without her or something. I needed a partner. Like, she was like my biggest supporter, and I was the oldest and the only girl, and she never had a career, so everything was like into me and whatever. Anyway, I just
And you ended up with family. You created family, you created people.
Like,
yes,
was a traditional route like Sarah did in a way. That was the traditional route, even though she was a priestess and she had a life and had a career in a way, right? And then for some reason she decided to get married. So,
I mean, who knows? But it's like really, she faced that juncture. Yes. And so now, who was it who suggested to Abraham, why don't you take the handmaiden Hagar and make a baby with her, since I'm not having any luck in reproducing a next generation or in producing a next generation? Who suggested that to Abraham? Yeah. Okay. Fran's on mute, but she knows the story. Sarah, it was Sarah's idea. It was Sarah's idea. And Abraham did do it. He, of course, Hagar and Abraham have the first child in that next generation, who is Ishmael. But it doesn't turn out the way Sarah expected it to be. And all we know from the Torah is that she saw Isaac being mocked. Ishmael was mocking, or in some way doing something that offended Sarah with her baby once she had her baby. So again, this could work in the story of Sarah the priestess, meaning that Sarah still had the desire to pass on some of her own cultural, precious, feminist content And she saw Ishmael, who was parented by a different culture and a different family, basically, Hagar and Abraham, preventing that from being what could unfold. Who knows? We're reading into the text here, because all the one sentence we know is that somehow Ishmael was mocking Isaac, or Sarah was offended by something like that. And that's when Sarah says, this didn't turn out the way Sarah had hoped it would. It was her idea to have that baby come into the family, but it didn't work out to be viable for her. How many people here have ended up in a family where it just wasn't viable? It would kill your spirit to continue on the path you thought you were on. I mean, for most human beings, this is something that ever happens in our lives. And Sarah is very much a human being. She made the plan, but she had to change the plan. And so with a lot of agency, which I think is something we're recognizing as her merit, she says to Abraham, cast out Hagar with the baby. And this would have been a death sentence. And Beverly spoke to not admiring that decision that Sarah made. But I just want to track what happens in the actual story is that God says, listen to Sarah. And Abraham does cast out Hagar and Ishmael. And many of us are very familiar with this because we read it on Rosh Hashanah every year, this story. But if you remember, Hagar lifts up her eyes and sees a well. And a well is what will save their lives in the desert, right? They need water. They're dying of thirst. And God says to Hagar, the blessing will also go through you and Ishmael. You're going to be okay. So to me, that's really interesting. Sarah gets chosen, and also Hagar gets chosen. So, families go through changes. Many of us have lived through families that have gone through changes. I mean, every family goes through changes. Babies get born, people graduate, people die, people remarry, all sorts of things happen. Families go through changes. Sarah's family had to go through some changes. It wasn't working to have a household of Sarah, Hagar, Abraham, these two kids. Who knows who else was in the picture? It wasn't working. And families do reconfigure. How many people here have ever been or have ever been in a family that reconfigured, either as children or as adults? Probably. Right? It's just human. And so this biblical record is a biblical record of Sarah taking agency in a really difficult situation. Joanne, you need to mute because you're okay. I think you're unmuted at the moment, though. Oh. Well, let's hope it's good. Okay, so facing a really complicated, difficult situation that was partly of her own making, she had chosen to bring Hagar in that way. Sarah had to use her agency and reconfigure her family. And partly that was in service of the continuity of the Jewish family tree, that she was trying to create this family tree through Isaac. So she was committed to basically her vision of partnering with Abraham for this Jewish continuity, we would call it. They weren't actually Jews yet, it was sort of pre-Judaism, but they were becoming the Jewish people because they haven't stood at Sinai yet. This is generations before, so they're not technically Jewish yet. That happens at Mount Sinai. So anyway, that's in the second era of Sarah's life there, where she's dealing with being an adult in a family. Who can relate to her there in that situation? I mean, it's a very, I hope people have some empathy for, like, she was facing a really complicated, difficult situation and she had to figure it out. Who can draw down merit from the fact that she was a human being facing a human life? I can. And did anybody else relate to her in any of those ways? Does anybody want to speak to that in any way? Okay, well, in that case, we are going to move on to the third era of her life, which is really the end of her life. And as you may remember, the whole binding of Isaac story takes place in the Torah. The very next story is called, the Torah portion is called Chayai Sarah, the life of Sarah. And the very first thing that happens is Sarah dies. In the Torah portion called the life of Sarah, she dies, and it's in first thing she dies, but it's immediately after the binding of Isaac. So anybody have any thoughts about that? And of course, she was a very old age. She lived a real big length of days. She actually lived to be 127. And I always think, you know, how there's a Jewish tradition of saying, may you live to be 120. Which was the age Moses lived to. I've always thought we should say, may you live to be 127, which was the age Sarah lived to. Ed.
Well, you know, the joke is that she died physically stunned by the craziness of her husband. You know, I guess that's a kind of a common joke that, you know, it was she learned what her husband had done. She keeled over.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, as a writer, where you place things in what order is very significant in your in the piece. So the fact that the you know, the binding of Isaac ends and then the next line is she dies. It's like you can't ignore that connection, that the placement of that line, you can't ignore it. I always read that as Isaac's life was almost taken and then Sarah died. You know, that's how I read it, always read that piece.
Yeah, I get that. And always with Torah, we turn it and turn it for different interpretations. I could equally well see she had lived 127 years. She realized Isaac came down from the mountain and it was all going to be okay. And it was the end of her life.
I'm not buying that.
You're buying the shock doctrine, okay?
Yeah, because he was her life. Isaac was like her life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a comment on the end of Sarah's life there? Okay, well, there's a big discussion in the Torah about the grave where Sarah is buried, which is the cave of Machpelah, which I believe is on the West Bank now and sort of in contested space. But this is the first, you know, wrapping around Sarah is the first kind of Jewish discussion about like, well, what are our kind of burial and mourning and like how committed are we and in what ways to creating these practices around the end of life. And so that's considered a very interesting first case of like creating the family cemetery kind of thing. Like the cave of Machpelah becomes the generational place where people get buried. And it also is it becomes a very there are moments where warring parties come together at these burials. And so it's also a sign of peace and of unity and people coming together. Okay, so 3 eras of Sarah's life there. She was a young woman. She was a married woman. We met her at the end of life. What do you take from that? Why are we supposed to draw merit from this righteous woman? What merit are we drawing down? What do you think? When we say by the merit of Sarah, yeah, Fran, go ahead.
Well, she had commitment in her life.
Mm.
She took a path, stayed with it, followed it. She was a, you know, leader in her decision making, creator of the family. And you know, just her huge commitment is one of the things I see.
Yeah, commitment. That's beautiful. Phyllis.
Yeah, I think she's very practical. She looks at the situation as it is at the moment, and she makes a decision of how she's going to go forward. And then as the situation changes, she looks at the situation as it is now, and she makes a different decision. So, in that she's very human, but also gives us a model for, you can only make decisions based on the information you have at the moment.
Yeah. So I'm putting these in the chat box. So commitment, meeting the moment. What else about Sarah would we draw down as merit? Ed?
Yeah, she just seems more human and more supple, more real, you know, like laughing at the three visitors from the kitchen. It's sort of like giggling in church, you know, it's just, it's, you know, I like that quality.
It's authentically human. I love it. What else about Sarah? Anybody got another one? Anybody else? I would say, okay, Karen, you got it? Yeah.
I mean, she's the first.
Yeah.
She's the first one.
True.
And also,
Also,
I also think she's like open to life. You know, if your theory or this woman's theory is right, she was on the path to being a priestess. Abraham comes along, she switches. You know, she hears that she's supposed to get pregnant at 99? And she's like, oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, how many of us are going to say, oh, yeah, I buy that, you know? So she was like open to life.
she was open to life. And I think that, you know, when she kind of joined Abraham, she didn't necessarily give up all of her values and practices. She seems to have wanted Isaac to have some of her religious, cultural, you know, heritage, because otherwise she wouldn't have minded that Ishmael was, you know, going to do it his way, maybe. So she kind of like, she was an integrator in a certain way, like she could take strands from different parts of reality and build them. I would say the word agency, you know, like when we got commitment, meeting the moment, authentically human, open to life. And I'm putting agency there just in that you're a decision maker in your own life, step by step. Anybody else want to add something that we'd be drawing down the merit for here? Okay, so next question. Does this in any way kind of change or alter your view of Sarah? Like thinking about her through a lens of humanity, not as a model necessarily of a particular thing, but more as a model of a process of facing life, living life, you know, being human. Does that seem like something you would want an ancestor who like sort of paved the way? Does it feel helpful to have an ancestor back there who's kind of being, what does that leave you with? That's Enid. Enid?
Yeah, I think one of the things she's also a model of is concern for her child, being a mother, that the safety of her child. And I wonder if she knew that Isaac was going to be okay, that therefore she could say, okay, he's all right, I can die. And that, you know, we all, our biggest concern, I think in many, of course, is for our children. And one of the, thank goodness I haven't had to face this, but many others here have. I think one of the greatest fears of a mother or parent is losing a child,
Yeah.
and she had to know that her child was going to be okay.
Yeah, and I would really broaden that to concern for the next generation, because she knew she was building a family tree. It was concern for the generations to come.
Right. And if Isaac did not survive, there wouldn't be that, or there was Ishmael, and therefore that family tree was going to survive and would have been a whole different story.
Yeah, so it wasn't just survival, it was survival with something that she wanted him to carry forward that probably came from her own spirituality, I'm guessing, you know? So thank you, Enid. I added it to the list, concern for the next generation. Ed.
Yeah, just following up Enid's thing, she's an example for all of us of incompleteness. The fact that she dies suddenly, just as Abraham and Isaac are freed from the burden of the Akedah, and they've sacrificed, and they're on the cusp of Isaac's young maturity, and she has to miss that. So she has to leave this life with things incomplete.
Yeah. And isn't that always the case? It's never the right time to leave life, right? There's always one more birthday party or grandchild or, you know, unfinished work. Yeah, that's very human. Thank you. Anybody else?
I would love to have had a grandparent like that, or a great grandparent, to be able to know and to hear their story like that. I mean, I have great grandparents who was my namesake, somebody who came from another country, right from Russia, the immigrant story, who came, followed her husband here, who'd sort of established a beachhead, and then she came with, you know, her life already pretty much intact. But then to actually talk to that person and know that person, to have that wisdom, oh, what a gift that would have been.
Yeah. Well, it's only in the last 18 years that the concept of the priestess has been revived. You all know about Kohens. Kohens were the priests, and that was the male lineage. But the idea of Kohenet, maybe about 18, 20 years ago, a circle of Kohenets that go through a rigorous training program and become the feminist priests in a feminist tradition has been revived. And that's what our music person, Avra, is a Kohenet. And there's a lot of Kohenets around here. I think that program has now ended. So there's 18 years worth of Kohenets now who have been trained. And that was to revive that ancient Sarah priestess tradition. A Kohenet is a priestess trained in Jewish spirituality. So just very interesting, because it's really in our generation, in all of your lifetimes for sure, that the women matriarchs have even been added into the Amidah. They aren't in Orthodox communities. And then there was a lot of question about how they would be added in other communities, because if you say Abraham and Sarah, are you saying, well, everyone should be in a heterosexual marriage? That doesn't seem right. And besides, the original is God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of, it's like everyone has a separate relationship with God. So God is listed each time separately. So shouldn't it be God of Abraham and God of Sarah, but not paired? So in some Sidurs, it's done differently in different denominations and different Sidurs, prayer books. Sometimes it's listed as God of Abraham, God of Sarah. Other times you go Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Rachel, which is more respectful in a way of that you don't have to be partnered in a unit to be, to have that merit. So in our congregation, we do it that way. And you'll notice in the Reconstructing Judaism Siddur, you could do it either way. You could either read down Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or you could read across, which would be Abraham and Sarah. So you have a lot of making it work the way you want it to work. But I always do it as not in paired units, but instead I do the founding fathers, I do the founding mothers, and we're going to be talking later in this series about adding in the other founding mothers who were Bilhah and Zilpah, the handmaidens, which we have ever done that in our community, but we don't always do that, and it does seem only fair. So I think we just have a couple minutes here now. Does anybody have a closing question or comment? And was anybody here in a community that struggled over adding the imahot, the mothers, to the Amidah? Rand, did you want to say something?
I just wondered about Miriam. Is she not one of the founding mothers? Because she doesn't have any children?
Well, she comes much later in the history. So she's, because if you think about it, these are the people at the very beginning of the Jewish family tree. Abraham was the first Jew. Sarah was the first Jewish woman, if you're using that word. And then those first 3 generations, the first 4 generations take us up to Joseph. So Joseph is the 4th generation. And as you know, he's basically helping run Egypt. And it was hundreds of years after that that the slaves, the Jewish people, the Israelites, get made into slaves and then have the Exodus. So Miriam's much later in the story. But over the years, Jewish women have definitely turned to Miriam and to many other Jewish kind of heroines from our tradition, like Deborah, Esther, right. The 5 books of Miriam is a resource there that treat her as perhaps equal to her brother Moses. So it is true that there are many, many women, but we're looking at what are called the matriarchs, which are these founding generations here. And on that note, we're going to sing our ending song. And then I thought, since it's the Omer and we're together now, we might as well count the Omer together, even though it's usually done at night, but we'll count the day and the night, which is this spiritual ascent period between the second night of Passover and Shavuot. We will be together for our annual meeting on Shavuot. So we're kind of journeying towards that together here. But let us start with our learning together song. You can be muted, but I'll sing along. For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say amen. And if you'd like to rise in body or in spirit to count the Omer. This is the 12th day and the 13th night of the Omer. Let's just repeat that together as a community. This is the 12th day and the 13th night of the Omer. And I will say, as we sit back down, that there always is a kind of mystical teaching for each of the days of the Omer. And right now we're in the week that represents might, just the might, the awesome might of what takes place in this universe. And that the day today is the quality of splendor within might. And if you've ever stood in front of a waterfall or a rainbow, you can kind of merge those, that sense of just incredible awe in a context that's so much bigger than you. You couldn't have created it. You're just in awe of it. That's the sort of spirit of today. And then tonight, we move into the concept of foundation within might, just being really grounded even in the face of those awesome things. Like, who are we in our lives, rooted, stable, centered, even as we face these kind of sometimes mighty and somewhat overwhelming situations in the world. I can relate to that a lot. How do you stay like really grounded, rooted, centered, even while you read the news about world events, for instance? So that's our quality for tonight. So folks, I will send us on our paths. And Karen, are you raising your hand there?
I just had one quick thought. I know it's late, but just you know, when you mentioned the news and the Middle East and Israel and what's going on, just that this foundation that or this conflict that happened between Sarah and Hagar. Like we're talking, you know, people think this problem is new or it can be solved simplistically, but it's so old. It's as old as us. It's as old as our religion.
Karen, thank you for bringing that up because it's really archetypal in some way.
Yes, it is. It's like huge. It's huge.
And I think what we have to live into is that all of these people are children of Abraham. Abraham is the unifying, right? Like that's to me the moral message that Palestinians, Jews, we are all children of Abraham, literally. And, you know, we have different other things we carry, but we're all part of the same family. And we have to keep turning towards each other. We have to remember that the blessing will flow through all of us. That's the promise there.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that up. It is archetypal, yes. And we have to decide, like, what is the archetype that we're, you know, that will give us hope for the future? What is youth?
Just so old. You know, it's so many years. It's so old.
What is the psycho-spiritual, historical takeaway that will help us build a better future? And I think it's that we are all children of Abraham. We're in it together. We're one big family, and we got to turn towards each other and work it out. So we're going to end on that note. Thank you all. I hope to see a lot of you in the coming days. We have a Shabbat service coming up. We have our annual meeting coming up. We have all sorts of good stuff. So check the calendar and come one, come all. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, for the idea.
Rabbi really took off with it.
Great idea.
I was going to ask you also, like, this was the first manifestation of your idea. How give me some feedback there. How do we do?
I think you did great, and you've gone far beyond what I wrote up, so it's great.
All right. Well, we're going to carry on. We're going to take it into the next generation next time. Really good.
And thanks, Louisa, for handling the Zoom.
Yes, Louisa. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Really helpful. Everybody enjoy the rest of the day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hi, Joan. You finally got on.
Yeah, we finally see you.
Joan, you're muted, but we're sending you love. Sending you love.